I'd highly recommend viewing this episode on YouTube rather than as an audio podcast because there are many visual examples presented. Hello and welcome to the Color Mentor podcast. My name is Paul Hanrahan. I'm a colorist, originally from South Africa. Now I'm based in Taiwan. On this podcast, I'm going to be talking to people who have mentored and inspired me on my color grading journey over the years. So welcome to the show. If you'd like to learn more about color grading, you can head over to my Patreon. It's called Color Mentor at patreon.com, and it includes basic skill training all the way up to full coursework on various topics. I also offer one-on-one mentoring for those who want to refine their craft further. But without further ado, let's get on with the show. In this episode, I chat to Charles Poynton. Some of you will know him as one of our industry's foremost educators, but he's had a very formidable career. I'll read a section from his website. He's an independent contractor specializing in physics, mathematics, engineering, and programming of digital color imaging systems, including digital video, VFX, CGI, digital intermediate, and digital cinema systems. He's been involved in engineering wide color gamut and high dynamic range systems. He does technology forecasting, system modeling, algorithm development, video signal processing architecture, color characterization, and calibration and image quality assessment. Now, that all sounds very technical, very engineering, but what's interesting about Charles is he maintains this idea of what it's all for. Why do we do this? And the fact that often it's all in the service of telling stories. And we discuss this quite a lot. So also on his website, it's about 25 years ago that he decided that HD should have 1080 rows and square pixels, other compared to the standard that was being proposed. He's been involved in developing many of the industry standards that we use today. So for example, sRGB, the ICC color profiles, and a whole long list. He's written one of the most commonly used textbooks in our industry titled Digital Video and HD, Algorithms and Interfaces. I'd highly recommend taking a look at that. In December 2024, he hosted a Metamerism Experts Day, which was attended by a wide range of industry experts to discuss various ways that Metamerism is successful, and that's what we want, and how increasingly now with modern technology that we get more and more Metamerism failures. So we talk deeply about this event, and also many aspects of his illustrious career. So I hope you enjoy it. Hi there, Charles. Very happy and very honored to have you on the Color Mentor podcast. I have kind of seen your writings and heard about you at a long distance. And then now more recently, we've been chatting online with various other color geeks of sorts who are interested in this amazing film and the details of color vision and perception and all these wonderful things. And then I heard that you had a very interesting talk last year, December, about Metamerism. And so I was very keen to get you on for a slightly more formal chat, which we could go on put on my podcast. So very welcome to the Color Mentor podcast.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And when you talk about that other string of conversations we've been engaging in, geeks, that is right. Wow. Really good. But it's a pleasure to chat with you. And I'm very happy to talk about Metamerism and other things color science are related.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of there's serendipitous things going on. Like Bram he is in Taiwan this week, so maybe I'll meet up with him. And he was one of your experts. You actually had it on my birthday as well. I see.
December 4th was your birthday. Let me write that down. So Bram was there as one of the special invited guest presenters. So it was in December, as you mentioned, in London, and it was called Metamerism Experts Day. My idea was that it's not just the people presenting who are the experts, it's everybody in the room. And so it was a group of 40-ish, and Bram was one of them.
You know that Bram is from a long line of display people. His dad was in the biz.
I do know the story. Yeah, and I joke with him. I mean, it's sort of a delicate, subtle joke, and one is always hesitant to try humor on other cultures, but I call him Bram de Smet, because that's
Okay.
the Belgian pronunciation of the name, right? He
Uh,
is the Smith.
right. Okay.
It's the Belgian version of Bram Smith or of the Smith, which meant that his father, I guess, was the Smith. But in the US, people are pronouncing his name phonetically, and he's totally okay with de Smet, which is what most
Yeah.
people call him there. But Bram and I go back quite a way.
Yeah, he was saying his family discussions were all like his dad was saying, "Oh, the CRT generation. That was the cool
Yeah,
shit.
yeah,
You new kids have got
yeah.
nothing."
Yeah, I mean it's Flanders scientific. It comes from Flanders,
Right.
uh, which and honestly, I'm always confused. I'll have to check my map on this whether Flanders is the west of Belgium. I can't quite remember. But I visited Barco. So Barco is historically the Belgian American radio company, BARCO.
Oh, okay. Cool.
The B is
Makes sense.
Belgium. And
Right.
their headquarters and most of their engineering is still in Belgium. I visited there well, half a dozen times or so. On one of maybe even my first visit to Kortrijk, this Barco headquarters city in Belgium, I sort of sought out a very storied and experienced Barco engineer who had even by that time retired. And now I'm talking about maybe 15 years ago. But he invited me to his house to have a glass of wine. And, in my head, I pictured this as being very much Brahms' dad. I mean, it
Right.
wasn't, it was someone else. But
Equi
it was that highly,
equivalent.
highly technical Barco guy
Yeah.
who's sort of in the later stages of his career, who you can just tell from his wife has got a basement full of the, museum.
CRT coils. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think Brahms' father had already moved to the US, if I remember Brahms' story. But his father was very much a Barco, TV display engineer. And no, Brahm picked up on it.
While we're digging in the history here, let's just do people a service who maybe don't know you well. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
if they go to your website and they take a look, they'll be very
Oh yeah.
surprised to know things like, pioneering the fact that displays never had a gamma 2.4 standard, the
Oh
fact
yeah.
that pixels were never square, and the fact that we 1920 by 1080, which just rolls off the tongue now, is actually
Yeah, yeah,
all
yeah.
somehow related to you. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
you've
Yeah.
also been
So
around.
no, I've been around. I mean, you can tell from the not gray but white hair.
It seems like these are all things that, like, the television industry operates on backwards compatibility. So it just carries on year by
Yeah.
year, and new things get pasted on top of it. Yeah, lots of these endeavors that you've been involved in are saying, come on, this is ridiculous. Let's like
Yeah.
sort something out. Let's get a display standard, a gamma standard. Let's
Yeah, yeah.
standardize our pixel aspect rate. It seems like that's often been your
Yeah.
role. And maybe is that your same role that you had about metamerism?
No, Metamerism a bit different. I mean, for Metamerism, giving you the modern interpretation, the Metamerism is a problem not yet solved.
It's getting worse
And
and worse, right?
and we'll talk about the details of that. But going back to some of the things that I've done in my career, let's say the pivotal time for that HD thing was in the early 90s when
Right.
I was living and working in California, working for a computer company. Even before that, I had done SMPTE standard stuff. I absolutely paid my dues. Well, not only SMPTE, but also even as it was then called CCIR, which then turned into ITU-R. So then when I was working for Sun in California,
Sun Microsystems.
Sun Microsystems,
Ah,
yeah.
okay, cool.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Mm.
And so, it was the pinnacle of the workstation era. So they were building engineering workstations, which were spectacularly good for engineering
Yeah.
and, very storied and famous and influential, while Apple was struggling to build desktop computers. And when I say struggling, I mean Apple almost went broke during that era. Literally while I was, not that there's any causality, but while I was in California, Apple nearly went broke.
Right.
And, that's the era when Steve Jobs got thrown out and then got brought back as the Messiah and
Right.
started what happened today. So then during that era, I went to Sun knowing a lot about studio video equipment and standards. So I had already cut my teeth doing digital video standards, including even working on the various committees that standardized what is now BT 601.
Right.
So that was basically digitizing analog video. But it was tricky because you had to choose the correct sampling rate.
Right.
That ended up being 13.5 megahertz, which is then kind of the least common denominator of all of the sampling rates we use today for UHD and 4K and the rest. And so then by 1990, HD was happening as I was already engaged deeply in the standards process. And so just to give you that story and then kind of return to the philosophy, basically I was on the various committees and doing work in the background and submitting documents on what are the correct numbers to choose for HD. And Japan, in the form mainly of NHK and Sony, but it was really a national effort in Japan, had already agreed upon the standard, which was 1920 by 1035.
Whoa. Okay.
And they'd already agreed. And then they submitted that to the international organizations and to SMPTE. And I pointed out that's not a nice number.
No.
Because it makes the pixels 4% narrower than they are high. And, basically the Japanese contingent in the form of a very particular pair of people working for a very particular Japanese company, but they were in New Jersey, basically took me out to dinner one night at a SMPTE conference and said to me, Charles, that's a really great idea. But that train has already left the station.
Right.
And that's the exact quote. I remember it like it was yesterday. And after sort of the next morning, said to myself, oh, no, it hasn't. Because I realized that HD would never be integrated with computing unless you had a raster standard that would be common between the two. And, even if the pixel counts are different, you need to have equally spaced vertically and horizontally.
Yeah, I mean, I think people who weren't in the industry in that era, they don't realize that they were literally two different industries. And it was the world computer displays and what we did in television. I mean, I got into the industry as things were moving from analog to digital. So when I was a Telecine assistant, I was already kind of a few years into my career. I was laying down to digital Betacam, but I started off with Betacam, SP. Totally. So it was all analog. So. Yeah, and so you had to choose a frequency that would satisfy 60 hertz and 50 hertz and all those good things.
Yeah, in fact, even a little bit worse, 59.94, because if you think back to the SD era, there was no video at 60 hertz. It was all 59.94. And so there's a sort of locally famous little derivation of math that I did. I guess maybe it's in all of my books. Because, I've done 3 books, but they kind of build on each other. It's kind of, as the publishers call it, they're superseding editions, even though I changed publishers partway through. But I think in all of them, there is this 3-page story about what is that numerical relationship. And it all hinges on the 1,000 over 1,001 relationship of 59.94.
Drop frame.
It's a relationship of 59.94 to 60. And so then it was very tricky to pick that 13.5 megahertz standard for SD, and then HD built on top of that. And so by the time of HD, then it was fairly clear that the HD sampling rate needed to be 5.5 times the SD. And that's basically 4 times because it's twice as wide and twice as high,
Right.
but a little more because it's got a wider aspect ratio.
Oh, yeah, yeah. 4:3 to, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Okay.
that's how you get to the
Oh,
5.5. So then and so then the classic HD sample rate 74.25. And you can tell these numbers are just rolling off my tongue, right?
right.
Uh, but by the time you get there, that relationship is pretty straightforward only because the 13.5 was already carefully chosen. But
Yeah,
then the question is, what are the counts? And Japan
right.
said 1035.
Yeah,
And I said, no, 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 let's have 1080. And Japan basically said, well, we can't do that. And what they didn't say, and it's classic Japanese culture, that, you know, culturally, Japan cannot say no.
right.
A Japanese, I mean, a steeped in the culture Japanese person, when they say yes, what they are telling you is, yes, I understand exactly what you just said. It doesn't mean, yes, I agree with you.
Right.
And then there's a famous, little sub story for us, which is in exactly that time, like the early 1990s, the founder of Sony, Akio Morita, he wrote a book which was then translated to English under the title. So it's the title of his book, The Japan That Can Say No. And then what was going on there was that Japan, a lot of people considered them subservient. And so Morita was very familiar with American culture. And he basically was declaring to America, well, yeah, we can say no.
Yeah,
We can have things the way we think.
yeah,
So then the Japanese culture figured in my, I hate to use the term battle, and it was just me on the other side, basically. I mean, I won that argument from just extreme levels of technical persuasion. I didn't pull out any political wild cards. It was the correct technical solution, and that nobody had any doubt about that. So then the skirmish was basically convincing the Japanese enthusiasts or Japanese American in the case of the Japanese companies promoting HD in the US. It was convincing them. I mean, they never actually agreed that 1035 was wrong. But forces of the computer industry were getting stronger by the month at that time. And, the broadcast industry was beginning to decline in its technical dominance. So anyway, I won.
right.
That's good thing because
It's a good round number. I mean, at that time, it was the 1280 by 720 or the 1920 by 1080, all of that. And it just, yeah, I mean, if it was 35, then you'd be doubling to, yeah, no, it would just be a bit uglier.
so then just to indulge myself to give you a little more of the history or the trajectory, I had joined Sun to do video, but basically halfway through my 5 or 6 year tenure there, I realized that they weren't going to be that Sun was and the other workstation vendors, including at that time SGI, that was really prominent,
Right.
they were not going to be able to do, how do I put it? I mean, I think I can say serious video. I mean, you and I know that SGI ended up building machines that made,
Yeah, flame and all that
well,
stuff.
yeah, the infrastructure, at least at SGI, was sufficient to do real-time graphics to a certain quality level of that time. I'm struggling to think of any SGI based machines that were doing even like real-time graphics for TV. I mean, those were typically big refrigerator sized hardware boxes.
Yeah.
The famous one being the Bosch FGS 4000. That was, so then this is the famous music video with the boxy characters. Was it Money for Nothing? So, but that was not an SGI machine because the SGI, being even the best of the crop for graphics, couldn't even do real-time video. I mean, it was superbly great machine for the day, but it couldn't actually do real-time video. So when it became clear to me that the effort of Sun and others to do video, including even kind of almost consumer class. I mean, you were thinking of it as industrial applications of video. It
Right.
became clear to me that that wasn't going to happen. And, this is the time when the Macintosh was, I mean, it was just barely that could do 8-bit color lookup table color, but it
Right.
was just barely possible to have a 24-bit frame buffer for one frame. So it just wasn't feasible. So then what I did, I realized, these machines are not going to be able to do moving video, but they're going to do color, even if it's stills. And I'd better learn, I already know studio video color pipeline. I better go and learn some more color. And so then the second half of my career at Sun was doing color technology, including being one of the dozen or so people who devised the ICC color management system framework.
Right. Okay.
So then that was my introduction to color transforms and color math. And I already knew a bunch of it, but I had to go and learn a lot about cameras
Yeah.
and a lot about displays. And I was never an ink or printer expert, but I knew a lot about cameras and a lot about displays. So then, the ICC community sort of took me in because I understood that part of it. And I also understood really well the trade-off of the day of what was hardware, what was software, what was firmware, what was feasible. Um, so then that was my introduction to color. And so, we're headed toward metamerism here.
Yeah. Because at this stage, whether you're computers or whether you're on television broadcast, you're looking at CRTs, right?
This was exactly when the very first LCD displays were being commercialized. It was
Okay. So
exactly this
just the
time,
transition. Okay. Yeah.
right on the edge, right on the edge. So then, as I was kind of packing up in California to leave to come back to Toronto, SGI had just introduced an LCD display for the SGI product line. So they had identified a panel from Japan at that time, and they wrapped injection molded plastic around it, did some interface work. I'm struggling to remember. That might have been shipped with a DVI-D interface. But you remember the good old days. I mean, the first DVI connectors,
Yeah. Yeah.
they had
Those big fat things. Yeah.
they had screws, but they had 4 pieces of analog coax in them, as well as a bunch
Uh,
of digital connectors. Like you
right.
could use that cable and that connector for analog video because
Right.
the people who did the display interfaces realized we can't just do a hard switch.
Right.
We need to give a soft transition scenario to the whole marketplace. So I can't even remember whether that SGI display was a native digital interface or not, but it was early, early, early days for flat panel. And then, it only took 10 years for LCD technology to just completely take over.
Right.
And they didn't take over. I mean, people were typically not throwing away their analog CRTs because now they could get something new and different.
Yeah.
I mean, the analog CRTs, well, I used a pair of 19-inch CRTs for, God, must have been easily 15 years. They don't wear out quickly.
And they look great compared to those LCDs looked crap. The black level was terrible, etc., etc. They weren't bright enough. It was just...
Well, I was very much engaged in the CRT image quality and black level and interface and setup and, gain and,
yeah.
brightness contrast controls. At Sun, that was also part of my job
Yeah.
to make sure that Sun displays. And Sun was simply rebadging Sony Trinitrons,
Right.
during that era. So, we'll in the intervening 20 or 25 years, then we can talk about what happened with wide gamut and what happened with HDR.
Right.
But then it brings us up today
Yeah.
to metamerism, which is, where we end up in our conversation.
But don't forget the important thing of the having to add the the 1.2 gamma to get the LCDs to look like the
Yes.
CRTs,
Well,
and then to standardize 2.4 as a display
yes.
calibration format and all that kind of thing.
Yes. So then this is deep, long, complicated stuff. And I had a hand in kind of all of that you just mentioned.
Okay.
And, we can talk about that to some extent, even, today, because although it's not directly metamerism, it has absolutely related to um, accuracy or faithfulness, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
And then those are kind of two different things, as it turns out. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
Back when I was in California, it was chaos in terms of what the reproducibility or the accuracy of displays, including even CRTs. So this was sRGB era, right?
Yeah.
So then
Yeah.
I had long discussions with the people who had figured out, and they were primarily Microsoft and HP, who figured it because HP was making printers. And so it was to their interest to make sure that people had, somewhat predictable color. And, Microsoft was dominant at the time. So then a couple of Microsoft people and a couple of HP people took it upon themselves to try to rein in all these hundreds of different monitor standards, and they basically invented sRGB.
Right.
And so sRGB, basically the document hit the streets in maybe 98. So it's 25 years old by now. Then at that time, Macintosh had wacky gamma. I
Right.
mean, they were using trinitrons, so they had great color, great image quality, but they had a wacky gamma. And that number historically arose basically from offset color printing. And it's a long, complicated story, but Apple decided they had to change. And so then essentially they changed to sRGB. I mean, they called it moving from gamma 1.8 to gamma 2.2, but it was essentially more or less going to sRGB. And then the 1.2 power thing, well, that's much more complicated. And that is absolutely something that colorists need to understand. And many, 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 many colorists don't. In fact, literally last evening, I was just cruising through LinkedIn, just going to look it up and read it to you. Well, this thing about EOTF and OETF.
This is one of the things that sits as the backward compatibility. We can't, at no point in our industry can we just say, okay, everyone tools down, let's start again with something new. There's this kind of, okay, because CRTs, then this, because that, then this, because black and white TV, hence color TV.
Yeah, yeah. And some of that is well founded and some not. So
Right.
then the thing that we're missing, and we're missing this even still today, and certainly we were missing it when I was doing this work to try to wrangle those things to become one industry, in the
Right.
mid 90s.
Right.
Sometimes it's engineers and technical leaders who mistakenly cling on to old ideas because
Right.
that's the way we've always done it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's rooted in sensible reasons, like there's just huge elements of the installed base that we can't change.
Right.
And, one analogy here that I sometimes use is touch tone telephones. So, I mean, because, I have white hair. When I was a kid, the phones were dial phones. And so then,
Yeah. Yeah.
but when touch tone phones were introduced, the switchboard, the exchange would respond to either
Right.
on the same line. So then you in your house could have a new touch tone phone, but you could also have two old dial phones
Yeah.
if you had a big house. I mean, the house where I grew up, there was one phone. Um, but then, that's a compatibility thing, right?
Right.
And to this very day, 2025, on a wire line to the phone exchange, which is already hard to find, but it will respond to a pulse dial, and so it's been that way for 85, 90 years, maybe even 100 years.
I remember being able, you could tap out the number with tapping the
I
receiver.
And I did this too. Yeah. Here's the line. And I'm not going to tell you who this is because,
So,
my goal is not to
yeah.
embarrass anybody. I'm not even a color scientist, but I find many of these topics somewhat easy to grasp, like EOTF, OETF being inverses of one another.
Fair enough.
Well, the thing is, they're not.
Anymore.
Anymore. Well, and it was never clear that they weren't in the old days. But even in the old days, they weren't.
Right.
When I did my sojourn in California, basically 88 to 94, something like that, I came back to Toronto, which is where I'm sitting today, to write a book. And so I wrote a bunch of this up because I understood a bunch of this at the time. And even at that time, 30-ish years ago, I understood that EOTF and OETF were not inverses even for SD and even for analog SD. And it's where the number 1.2 comes from. Right? And
Right.
we can talk about that later. So, but then just to give you a notion of the magnitude of the problem. So this guy on LinkedIn posts, to wit of these things being somewhat easy to grasp, I implemented a PQ to linear ST2084 from scratch in a couple of hours a few months back. It was pretty trivial. Well,
Right.
okay, that part is trivial.
Yeah.
But the part about the EOTF and the OETF, you do not understand.
Right.
So, you're telling us all that you find it easy to grasp. And, the quote here is from H.L. Mencken. So, scientist, if I remember correctly, he's a geneticist. So I'm completely out of our arena. But the quote
Right.
is, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And that's this guy, right?
Yeah.
So then I posted the follow-up, which then, well, you know what? I think I'm going to read it because I think, because your fans are generally colorists,
Yep.
then they should know this. You may find these topics somewhat easy to grasp, but you are seriously wrong. And, I always hesitate nailing somebody. The SDR 709, and then I'm going to do a little notation thing to you, //.
Right.
So then the process of OETF //, in other words, followed by
Yeah.
EOTF, the pipeline is 709-1886. And 709, if you go read the spec and implement the equation, although it's a little wacky the way it's written up, it amounts to a square root. And BT 1886, it's just right there in the equation in the document. It's a 2.4 power.
Right.
Those are not inverses.
Yeah.
In fact, you can get the overall end-to-end result. It's the power function that just multiplies those two exponents. So then that's the 1.2. So
Right.
what's happening in SD is the camera is deriving radiometric scene referred signal numbers and just put them
Right.
from 0 to 1.
Right.
You get to pick the exposure and so on.
Yeah.
But they're just 0 to 1. Pick one as the diffuse white or the reference white.
Yeah.
If it's HDR, it goes way above that. And then the 1886, and then you take the square root, but then you don't take the square. You take the 2.4 instead of the square. And
Right.
so what's happening, there's a signal manipulation in between.
Right.
And that manipulation turns out to be for the purpose of technically dialing up the chroma a little bit,
Right.
and technically dialing up the physical contrast a
Yeah.
little bit. And those two things,
You're pushing the midtones down a little bit, right? Are you down?
you could say that you're pushing the midtones down a little bit. I'm always hesitant to describe it in those terms, but you are in fact exactly correct. providing you conceptualize the whole picture as an alteration in radiometric linear light space.
Right. Oh yeah, yeah. You got to get
So
back in light. Yeah.
yeah, you're going in, but you're going into a nonlinear weird space and then coming back out.
Right.
But the effect is, as you say, and in
Yeah.
fact, in cinema, so photochemical film, Kodak knew perfectly well, and even a dozen or two of your fans, they'll remember some of those old Kodak numbers.
Right.
Like if you shoot 18% gray, where is that supposed to end up? First on the neg and second on the print.
Right.
And if you do those calculations according to Kodak for photochemical film, this is all sensitometry, right?
Yeah.
What you discover is that Kodak, if you just use their film according to the data sheet, develop according to the data sheet, measure according to the industry practices, and project, and then measure,
Yeah.
what you find is that 18% gray turns into 13% gray on the screen.
Okay.
And that is exactly what you just mentioned about, the midtones, the mid-gray are diminished. And that is exactly the effect conceptually of that 1.2 function that you get even in SDR. And then when we get to HDR, it's still there, but now it's a more complicated story because you've got all that stuff above reference white. Yeah, I mean, the most important thing about HDR is make sure you get the range from black to diffuse white correct. I mean, that remains critical.
Yeah, remains the same, and then just the highlights. Yep.
Now you got to make that the same, otherwise you fail.
Yeah.
But then what's from reference white or diffuse white up, and then radiometrically you might have 5 times. If it's a camera, you might have 40 times.
Right.
You might be 5 stops up on the brightest specular highlight or direct light source, but typically in post and certainly in distribution, maybe the specular highlights are 5 times the nits, the luminance of the diffuse white. If there even is a diffuse white, that's a separate story. Then he thinks that the OETF and the EOTF are inverses because obviously you need to take light and map it to the same light levels.
Right.
But that's not the case because typically we're acquiring in very bright illumination and displaying in rather dim illumination.
Right.
So you might meter a white chip on a Macbeth card. I mean, I do all the science. Like I'm not metering things in stops. I'm measuring the candelas per meter squared. So a white chip on a Macbeth chart under overcast daylight might be 3,200 nits.
Right.
But in the cinema, you're going to display that white at 32 nits.
Exactly.
That's 100 times
Yeah.
less. If it's really bright outside, like it's not overcast, it's a clear day, you're going to meter the white chip at 32,000 nits, in which case the cinema is 1/1000th of the amount of, you can call it photons.
Right.
So what that does is your visual experience down at those low display levels, it's like looking at the scene in twilight instead of looking at it in daylight, if you were to mathematically do everything correctly. And so the reason to impose that 2.2 function is to increase the colorfulness so that it can reasonably well portray the colorfulness of daylight
in the limited range. Yeah.
At 32 nits.
It's a whole nother topic that we can save it for another day. But the idea that you can only take the scene portrayal, capture and portrayal, you can only take that metaphor literally to a point. But at some point, it's literally It's like carving a sculpture out of a piece of stone, or painting on a piece of, with oil paints
Yeah.
on a canvas. It is a piece of art. It's not actually the real world
Yeah.
that
No,
we're making.
absolutely.
It's a TV picture, and we have equivalent kind of metaphorical theories. But yeah, at the
Yes.
end of the day, it's because what I find fascinating is it's always a mixture of technical decisions, mathematics, plus creative decisions. How the endpoint of why is it an OETF of 1.2? Why not 1.3? Why not 1.4? It's
Yeah. Yeah.
because people actually stood there and looked at it and thought, okay, a little bit more, a little bit more. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
We're done.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? It's a
And
creative choice.
that's,
Yeah.
I described the photochemistry and the kind of baseline from Kodak doing everything according to the data sheets, but they came up with those numbers from visual evaluations.
Right.
Those numbers didn't arrive to us from physics or math of
Yeah.
the universe. That's a visual choice. And when I teach this stuff in long form, like one day workshop, like Lawrence Ori and I do, and
Right.
Lawrence's name will come up in Metamerism in a
Yeah.
few minutes when we switch to that. But he's a colorist. He's A-list super good colorist.
Yep.
And he and I are clear that when we explain these things, we say what rules here is what your portrayal on your display when you do the final grading, how you see that picture.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what the scene is. Everything
Yeah.
else prior to that is just means to an end.
Right.
It needs to be convincing for you according to the story that's being told.
Yep.
And then you've got the instincts because you're an experienced colorist that it's going to be convincing to the director.
Right.
Like if the director, I mean, I guess they sometimes walk in and say, well, can you make that a little more moody? Can you make that a little brighter? Well, I don't know.
Every day
I
of
mean,
the week.
so then that's not science. That's artistic intent.
Right.
And so then the 1.2 business, that's just my science baseline. Um,
Exactly. Starting point. Yeah.
the way I usually describe this when Lawrence and I are teaching it, I talk about the situation of the image at ingest time, like what the camera footage should look like when you first bring it in. It
Right.
should be reasonably convincing. I hate to use the word like natural, but it should look reasonable.
Yeah. What I would say in telecine language, it was always our base setting as per the Kodak
Yeah,
alignment
that's
film. Base. Yeah.
exactly. It's textbook setting. And
Yeah.
then you, as a colorist, you are imposing the art as kind of proxy for the producer and the director. And your instincts have been developed over a decade or two or three.
Yeah.
So what
Well,
they're going
it's actually what I've got up here on the screen. These are various Kodak TAFs which I got my hands on.
so obviously there's some film engaged here. And another part of this is oddly what we expect the movies to look like, which was culturally determined by the look of film. So, and people are already always putting film print emulation LUTs.
Oh, more than ever. More than
And
ever.
more than
Yeah. We're heading towards displays with narrow primaries, etc. Hence Metamerism issues. But CRTs, Bram sent me a SBD of a CRT, and it had some weird stuff going on there. Weren't there two spikes in the long wavelength or something?
So I know this really well from exactly the era that I worked at Sun. So even from 30 years ago, in order to get a bright red, or let me put it this way, the conventional red phosphors of the 70s were not very red.
Oh,
They
okay.
were kind of orange, what you and I today would call orange,
Yeah.
and not very bright. So, in order to get a really colorful and bright red, required somewhat esoteric chemistry.
Right.
And now I'm talking basically early 80s. And that chemistry involved what's called rare earths. So the ones that, I'm not a chemist, but the ones that I can think of are yttrium. Another one is erbium. So they're unusual, they're not everyday elements, but you can find them. And if you irradiate them with electrons, they're very red.
Right.
So Sony was the first to figure out that if you mix these rare earth elements into a phosphor material, it's really red. It has really bright. But it has two rather narrow spikes.
Right. Okay.
So it was, back in the 90s, then the CRT plot was a kind of Gaussian for blue, a kind of Gaussian for green, and two peaks for the red.
Yeah.
And it's relevant today because then even back in the day of the, 90s, that's a narrowband stimulus. And
Right.
metamerism turns out to be all about narrowband stimuli. And,
Right.
maybe we nudge now toward
Right.
Metamerism.
The present day.
And also Bram, because I have a little story about Bram.
Oh, please go ahead.
Well, I invited Bram. So then the Metamerism Experts Day, and oddly, there's a Metamerism event taking place, although not a day, it's only a half day, in London, like literally right the instant that we're recording.
Wow.
Sponsored by IMIS, and it's sort of open, more open than mine was because mine really was the experts,
Right.
and Bram was one. My colleague and friend Lawrence Ori was one, and there were 6 or 7 other people who we'll probably mention as we go.
Yeah, definitely.
Attending this event in London on December the 4th. But at IBC, so basically exactly 1 year ago, Bram very kindly invited me to come to dinner with him and a few other people. And I happened to be sitting next to Bram at dinner, which was, I think, 8 of us. And at one point, Bram leaned over. So this is even before Metamerism Experts Day. So Bram leaned over and said, had a kind of quiet lull in the conversation and said to me, Charles, we're all interested in and concerned with metamerism with respect to displays, and in particular observer metamerism, which you and I can talk about in a
Right.
moment. But wouldn't it really be more correct if we called it metamerism failure instead of metamerism?
Yeah.
And I basically scratched my chin for 15 seconds and said to Bram, "Isn't that a little pedantic?" And the entire table, because it was a quiet moment in the conversation, the entire table burst into laughter. And Bram then also laughing said, do I just understand that Charles Poynton just called me pedantic? And he said, I'm going to make T-shirts with
Right.
exactly that. I'm typically the one that's being accused of pedantry.
But it's true. I've actually heard it mentioned in that way, metamerism failure, and I think that really works. That makes a good sense to me.
So then, literally, then after IBC, so then I ended up going to LA and basically arranged to meet for coffee with Steve Yevon,
Right.
who I knew of really, really well, and he knew of my work. And so we were it's as if we were almost friends already. But, he was delighted that I had some time. I was delighted that he happened to be in LA. And so we met for coffee, and you can sort of picture it happening like coffee was 2 hours long, right?
Right.
And so, I don't remember. I probably related that story because it had just happened to Steve. And Steve then kind of took a moment, leaned back, scratched his chin and said, well, what's odd to me is that, we're all talking about metamerism failure, but nobody is really talking about metamerism successes, which is
Yeah.
really the key point.
Right.
And so he's a very thoughtful and interesting guy. So, and that is exactly precisely correct. So then it really loops back to the 90s when I was at Sun, and Sun Microsystems at some point formed an agreement with Kodak. And there were some Kodak people who visited Sun, even color management people. And it was pretty early in my Sun career. So I was just learning about the depths of color science. And it was a Kodak guy pointed out to me that the three spectral sensitivities,
Right.
which ideally you would call them the long wave, the medium wave, and the short wave.
If we're using the eye as a equivalent, yeah.
No, that is exactly right. That's what the vision scientists would use, and we'll talk about Andrew Stockman in a few minutes. That's the terminology that he would prefer.
Right.
But what's kind of important at a deep conceptual level is not yet calling them red, green, and blue.
Exactly.
Because they're not yet colors. Nobody saw them yet. So, and it's really physics that you want to talk about,
Right.
and not vision. So if you call them the long wave, the medium wave, and the short wave, it was this Kodak guy, maybe not even early 90s. This could have been 1989 that, I'm sitting in the audience relatively naive about these matters, but he says, well, you think of those three curves, and what determines whether you've got those three curves correct? Consider two displays which have got modestly different spectral power.
Right. Different primaries, yeah.
The peaks that differ, maybe it's the widths,
Yep.
maybe it's the shapes. But if those two different spectral stimuli produce the same color sensation, then you win. It doesn't really matter which set you use.
Right.
So those are the metamers. That's Yedlin's metameric success. That's not metameric failure.
Well, I mean, let's do due diligence here and just quickly say that basically from the 17 or 1800s, whenever Maxwell was alive,
Yep.
painting spinning discs and working out,
Yep.
oh, I can just take three colors, spin them very fast, and oh, it looks like gray. All the way through to the 1930s, when basically experiments were done to say that I can use three narrowband lights mixed together and they will look like a certain other color. And
Right.
essentially what has allowed, whether it's print media, visual media, even to some degree, I guess, paint mixing and that whole thing, which is probably the oldest of our color technology,
Yep.
has allowed us a system where we can essentially create media. So we don't have to always have the orange tree or the orange or the apple. We actually can make images that look, within our reasonable artistic sense, like this thing, or like the blue sky, like the yellow wall, like
Yep.
all these objects. So yeah, it's the root of media that we can have.
And that basic phenomenon, although was not called metamerism until a century later, but the Maxwell had a deep conceptual understanding of that. Maxwell and Young, Thomas Young was the other contemporary.
Right.
They got the drift that three numbers would suffice. 100 years later, we figure out, well, yeah, that means different spectra can be used, but they have the same percept, the same color sensation. So,
Right.
so then metamerism then at that point sort of forks into two domains. One is what's happening down around the display, and the other is what's happening up around the camera.
Right.
And then in the broader world, outside of our digital imaging stuff, there's the issue that if you have a set of spectra of inks or pigments, and then you illuminate them with one kind of illumination that's got a certain spectral signature, and then another kind of illumination that's got a different spectral signature, do the colors change?
Right.
So then that is called Illuminant metamerism. And that's a very, very, very big deal in printing and packaging. You and I don't have to mess with it because our display makes its own illuminant.
I'm sure that those printing industries went through the same hiccup. We went through the CRT to LCD.
Yeah.
They went through the
tungsten to LED illumination. Just like Steve Yedlin went through the headache on-set tungsten lights to on-set LED lights and that whole thing. So
well,
bumps.
Illuminant metamerism does figure up at the front end of virtual production. So then it is relevant to our domain today in acquisition.
Right.
But, in the larger printing and publishing and packaging industries, they even went through it with fluorescent.
Very spiky.
In between tungsten and LED. And this is the Philips fluorescent tubes, which they use in supermarkets at the meat counter.
Right.
And they basically have narrowband red, a little tiny bit like the rare earth phosphors in a Trinitron.
For the CRTs, yeah.
And they make the red meat look really red. They're also D65, basically.
So they don't necessarily have a good CRI. They just pump that one frequency.
They have a terrible CRI.
Ah, okay.
But they make red meat look really red.
That's
and
right.
Literally then supermarket people, the manager of your local supermarket and their lighting supplier has come to them with a Philips data sheet saying what a great idea it would be if you put TL84s on your meat count. So then it is absolutely metamerism failure, because if you illuminate that steak in your kitchen with your tungsten light, or even with, semi-broadband utility LED. So it's got a bit of a wacky spectral signature because it's really a blue LED with a visible blue to broadband yellow phosphor converter. The meat is not going to look like it looked.
Never as good as at the point of sale.
Yeah. Well, they work hard to make that happen. So then that is absolutely Illuminant metamerism. And then, if we fold this into our domain, particularly
because you had a lot of people who are straight up scientists, like Andrew Stockman is a ophthalmologist, so it's all about.
Well, he's appointed in the ophthalmology department. He would describe himself as a vision scientist.
Right. Okay.
And Andy Ryder is then a severely anomalous trichromat.
Oh, wow.
He's what we call a deuteranomalous. In common language, he's colorblind.
Right.
But most, quotes, colorblind people do actually have three different kinds of cones. It's just that typically one of them, has got a wacky spectral response.
Right.
And ordinarily it's shifted. And so Andrew and Andy, they are your experts on that matter, and Andy particularly because he sees it. So then when Andy when he walks into a movie with a modern projector,
laser, yeah,
particularly laser. So and I don't know, market penetration of laser projectors might be 25% by now.
I thought it was more, but yeah, okay, different for different countries. Yeah,
I don't think it's above 40 yet, because the Xenon, they last a long time.
Right.
They only bought these things 12 years ago. They want to run them for another 8 years.
Sure.
But yeah, there's a lot of laser projectors. So we'll use a very generous number. Let's say something like 40%.
Right.
So then if Andy walks into a movie with a laser projector, to him it looks pink.
Right.
The white looks pink. For him, visually, it doesn't color balance to neutral. It balances to pink. Where the world, to him, the white is white. Like what you say is white, he agrees is white in the world. In
sunlight, sunlight, or
or overcast even, because overcast just shifts the color temperature, but it's still very broadband.
Yeah.
So then the challenge there is narrowband illumination, and that is an observer metamerism problem. So then over in virtual set production land, that is either or both Illuminant metamerism, or more seriously, camera metamerism.
Yeah. Well, that's the snake that's eating its tail, the Ouroboros or whatever it's called. That's literally that. You're taking the thing that should be a display. Now you're popping it back in front of a camera. So maybe let's leave that one alone for a little bit. But okay, just to talk on the
and leave it alone because neither you nor I are on set on VP.
Well, I've been
much.
dragged into it, and I
Oh,
actually
I see.
last month in South Africa, I actually taught a course on it with the visual effects supervisor, and my role on that course was to say, this is the shit that you need to know. This is what you're getting yourself into.
Right.
The boosters are telling you this is the future of production. This is going to make things easy.
Yeah,
And my job is to tell you, no, it's not. It's going to make
right.
things harder, and you need to know
Yeah.
why.
Well, just if I can throw out a one-liner, and I
Go
don't,
ahead. Go ahead.
no,
Let's
I
talk
don't
about
call
it.
myself
Yeah.
an expert in this domain. I mean, I know pretty much all the science here, but I have also got enough knowledge of movie production to know that there's a lot more to it than the science. And in particular, it's what is declared to be correct is a decision from art, not from science.
Right.
So then I'm smart enough to know that. But from what I've understood from a few people that I've spoken with concerning virtual production, they would very much prefer to illuminate the talent with rather conventional lights.
Correct.
In other words, not using the LED screen as a source of illumination, but just as a source of imagery for the camera.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so then there's super good reasons for that because you don't want to illuminate skin with narrow band peaks.
Yeah, you basically get the meat counter situation which you were talking about.
Exactly.
People go very pink. But yeah, I mean, it seems like Brompton and Rowe and all these companies, they're going for essentially their fix for this is to now go for WRGB LEDs, 4 pixels, one is broadband, and then you can mix how much of the broadband on or versus the RGB you want, which is just a plaster. It's just a plaster on a problem. I'm a bit skeptical.
But they're also introducing cyan LEDs.
Right, there's the 6P.
Yeah, I mean, well, that then you can go further down that road. But certainly, I mean, when I look at the spectral plots, I see that there's very little advantage in introducing yellow or amber because the long wave and the medium wave, they're already fairly close together
Right.
on typical LED peaks, but there's a big gap on the way toward the so-called blue, then that might help the kind of Illuminant metamerism.
Maybe we can introduce this as a theme. I mean, I found about the ARRI orbiter. It's actually a 6 primary light. I thought, wow, this is cool. You can like build your own spectrum. And I don't know if you've ever played with them, but they're these, I think it's called Gamma Scientific, this company that makes these technical sources that you can calibrate on. And they've got 30 LEDs in them. Like you can build any SPD you want from a combination of these 30.
Yeah, well, there's Gamma Scientific, but there's also much smaller and much more specialized German company called Image Engineering.
Oh, okay.
And they make what conceptually you could consider to be a Macbeth chart, but each chip is an LED instead of a reflective color.
Wow.
But they're expensive.
Yeah, I'm sure.
15 or 20K euro. But people are using those as stimuli for cameras to characterize cameras. But then there are also other companies other than imageengineering.de. I mean, I think imageengineering.de have also got a version of that illuminates. The direct view version is actually interference filters. Tuned.
Right.
So they're narrow band interference filters, like 24-ish of them, and that kind of vaguely looks like a Macbeth. No, the other thing that I'm thinking of, they do also have a very large number of LEDs illuminating an integrating sphere with a port, and then you point your camera at that port. So then it's a tunable light source in the manner that you're describing, but now very much designed and marketed to the image science community, not to the general scientific community.
And you could take the lens off and just get essentially the whole sensor becomes one pixel color, because it's a diffusion sphere.
Yeah, right? Every pixel is. I mean, if it's an integrating sphere, then basically every pixel is receiving exactly the same radiometry. So Lawrence, he's a maker. So then he made maybe it's 75 by 75 by 75 millimeter box, which on one side has got a 3D printed PL mount,
Right.
tending to be a lens. And then inside is a mounting for a Thor Labs diffraction grating.
Wow.
So you illuminate this with wideband light, diffuse wideband light, and basically from one side of the image to the other, it's a spectral bandpass.
Your Newton's rainbow, yeah.
The camera image, the so-called RGB channels, read out the spectral response of the camera.
Okay, this is getting way ahead of ourselves here, but it's the one image that was redacted from the article in IMAGO about this talk was that one showing the spectral response of the area, and I thought, I wonder why that was taken out.
we don't say which camera. We say, camera A, camera B, camera C.
Okay, well, yeah, that's the secret sauce.
Anybody can rent, an Alexa and map out the spectral response. It's just hard.
Right.
And for whatever reasons, largely historical and traditional, the camera vendors do not publicize their spectral response. I mean, on the digital still camera side, there's like small numbers of hundreds of university researchers that have just, put the camera up next to their integrating sphere, next to their spectroradiometer, next to their gamma scientific xenon source.
Right.
They take it into their, $250,000 lab and plot out the spectral characteristics. But that's not typically done for motion picture cameras. They're not dramatically different. It's really the same technology.
Yeah. The point I wanted to add there was that my feeling was, let's go for the 6 primary. Let's put the primaries at these gaps in the spectrum. But I had this other thought to say that what if what we're missing is the ability to nudge the primary itself and to change its width? So because when we do calibration, when we do, the crazy stuff of calibrating a camera to point at a LED volume, or when we just calibrate a monitor, we're stuck with the primaries. So on displays and on cameras, we're stuck with the primaries. We can never nudge the primaries. So I thought, in an imagined theoretical model, is there any benefit in being able to nudge the position of the peaks of the primaries in a display or in a camera, or widen or narrow them as you want to increase or decrease the metamerism successes and failures?
Okay, so then this opens 2 or 3 or 4 points. Sadly, the first point has to be, from my point of view, so, I'm a scientist. I'm not wearing my lab coat. Actually, I don't own a lab coat, but I'm very definitely the scientist, the mathematician, the physicist here. I've got tons of experience signal processing for, video, HD, UHD, wide gamut, whatever. That's really my day job. But I have to point out as the first point, commercial economics. There's no doubt that you could build a piece of lab equipment where you tune the primaries.
Right.
But for our domain, we are doing distribution at a very, very, very large scale, billions of screens. And we're even doing acquisition at very large numbers of acquisition, 10,000 of them or some number like that. So then in order for any such idea to get traction in the world, it has to be practical to some extent.
Right.
So then that's idea number one. So, and I'm sorry that that's number one, but the roof over my head and my dinner last night, it's paid by people who are doing practical things with color. If my great grandfather had founded a bank or a railroad, then maybe I'd be building the devices you're referring to. That's not the case.
Exactly.
As Lawrence puts it, how does his expression go? I think the Dutch expression is what sends the smoke up the chimney. Like it's literally what's buying the firewood to keep your house warm, right?
Right.
So then the commercial thing that comes out to be number one.
Right.
Number two, physics. So can we find physics that's tunable? So, the laser cinema projectors, they are in one sense tunable in the form of sending a two-pager to your laser manufacturer and 6 months later getting the sample LED back. The
Right.
LED, the laser, sorry, I shouldn't say LED, getting the laser diode back.
Right.
So they're not tunable in any sort of rapid sense.
Yeah.
They have done the chemistry and the grinding and the polishing and the deposition and, the selection of the materials in order to get your wavelengths. And that's very much what Barco and Christie and NEC are doing. But again, the times that you're not turning a knob.
Right. Not seeing the change in real time. Exactly.
I mean, I can put those two, idea number one, idea number two together by reminding you that about 12 or 13 years ago, Sharp commercialized a TV that had 4 primaries instead of 3.
Oh, okay.
So they had yellow. Now, I've already mentioned that I wouldn't do yellow because the long wave emitter and the medium wave emitter are basically so close that there's not that much benefit. And you might do better to fill in the cyan.
Right.
Or, I mean, I shouldn't even call it cyan. Well, I could call it cyan. It's a cyan primary. And even Sony, so turning the tables and talking about cameras, in about the same time frame, so 15 years ago, Sony commercialized, let's call it a mid-range consumer digital still camera. And I'll give you the model number. It was DSC, and that stands for digital still camera, -F. I don't know what the F was, 828. It was very heavily advertised as having 4 sensor channels instead of 3.
Right.
So instead of RGGB Bayer, they had RGEB, where the E stands for emerald, and that is in fact cyan.
Right.
It's the same wavelength.
Yeah.
So then again, they're tuning, but now based on chemistry of the dyes that they mix up to make the chip. So again, it's not a knob, which you were kind of asking for. The lead time is pretty long, a year. And they gave a paper on it at the Preeminent Color Imaging Conference. And I was there sitting in the audience, scribbling notes like crazy, because up on the white, that it was a late breaking paper, so which wasn't actually on paper. It was only presented.
Yeah.
I guess being 15 years ago, like everybody didn't have an iPhone in their pocket. So it isn't the case that everybody's just taking out their iPhone and snapping pictures of the photographs. But I'm scrawling all the numbers down in the back row, right? And so among those numbers are not a 3x3 matrix, but rather a 4x3 matrix.
Right.
Telling us how they mix the color. And so I thought this is all very, very, very interesting. And then someone else, not me, asked at the end of the presentation, well, how does the consumer activate this? Or is it activated? Or, how is this delivered to the consumer, this 4th channel?
Yeah.
And the answer from Kato-san from Sony was, well, actually, when we shipped it, we turned it off. So, the end of all this big time and trouble in engineering, it didn't deliver. I mean, there was some marketing benefit because they called it in the marketing literature RGB plus E. But in a sense, that was misleading because even though the emerald sensor subpixels were there, they weren't used. And it wasn't even clear to me whether the consumer could even turn them on.
Right.
So then to your query a minute ago, I mean, it's not exactly tuning the peaks, but it's adding a 4th one. Right. So we tried that. Sharp tried it with a display. Sony tried it with a camera. None of them work commercially, which brings me back to, idea number one, which is if you want any traction here, it's got to be practical in some sense.
Yeah.
So then, and so then now I have one other relevant story. Even in the days of Xenon, so even before laser cinema projectors,
Yeah.
in Xenon cinema projectors, which were basically all of the original first crop of 2K,
Right.
when digital cinema was introduced to the marketplace, most of them, nearly all of them, had TI DLP modulators and xenon light sources. Xenon is quite broadband, and the way the cinema projector worked is it had a set of dichroic filters to split this broadband illumination into 3 different spectral bands, modulate each of them with a DLP, and that's why it's called a 3DLP projector, and then recombine.
Right.
It was basically nothing short of brilliant engineering work that the original DLP optical block, the so-called prism, which is just an optical engineer's name for a big block of glass. Like it isn't doing a Newton diffraction. Instead, it's a block of glass whose surfaces are coated with dichroic filters. The TI engineers, and they won a technical Emmy for this, figured out how to use the same prism block to do the separation and the recombination. And that was basically just a hell of a trick. It was really spectacular. But then my story of this, which is their invention, is that they found that the splitting of the wideband light into 3, no matter where they put the splitting points, the primaries were too broad to deliver film gamut.
P3-ish,
They had to absorb light in what you and I would call the cyan region and the yellow region.
Right.
And they had to absorb light in order that the gamut was sufficient to mimic film. So then, we're speaking of wideband light sources, wideband primaries, narrowband primaries. So then with laser projectors, you don't need to absorb any light anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, you do actually, because the laser projectors are still, the laser just the illumination. You're not turning the laser on and off when you need light. It's just a broadband full frame illumination source.
Right.
And any light that you don't use on a particular pixel, you need to discard.
Right.
I mean, you literally use the DLP mirrors to deflect that light into literally a heat sink.
Yeah, a trash bag.
It's the light dump is what it's called.
Yeah.
And but it's the light dump, it's very black on one side, and it is absolutely a heat sink on the other side. It is radiating heat.
Yeah.
That is that unwanted light. And that then loops us into, well, what are the efficient displays? And the answer to that is very simple. They're the displays that don't absorb any light.
They only emit what needs to be shown to the viewer.
Exactly. And so then that's basically OLED, except for the fact that if it's an RGB white OLED, or even an RGB, if it's an RGB white OLED, it's got color filters. So it's absorbing light.
Absorbing, yeah.
And that's LG. And the QD OLED technology does not absorb any light. It's converting visible blue to visible green or visible red, but it's only emitting light which ends up being used. And the conversion in the quantum dot layer, it's quite efficient. It may only be 50 or 60%. I don't know those numbers, but it's quite efficient. And, there's loss.
Yeah.
Okay, technically you could call it absorption, but it's not absorption to the level that a color filter.
Right.
A color filter approach, if it's just white OLED, then very roughly speaking, you've got to absorb 2/3 of the light in order to produce usable color. And so it's like already 8 or 10 times more efficient than a classic LCD, but it's still QD OLED is ultimately more efficient. So then that's all, these are all elements that are related to your question. Could you just tune it? And what Andy Ryder has found that you don't even need to tune the primaries. It's enough to have a 3x3 matrix, or, your fans will understand this as a Da Vinci channel mixer.
Right.
It's enough to have a 3x3 matrix tuned to the observer. You don't even need to tune the peaks.
That's the underlying mechanism which we've always worked with. But there are some issues that come on the input side that if it's leading to another question that we'll get to in a moment. But let's say that a camera is just outputting some 3 primaries. We know that the camera raw is actually some other, black magic. But by the time it gets to 3 camera primaries, if you entering any color science pipe or color management pipeline, you're having to swap primaries. And sometimes what are 3 positive photon catches in one primary space might end up as some negatives in another space.
Yes, absolutely. And so then you as colorist need to deal with that. And one way, the simple way to think of it is, well, I manufactured out of gamut colors that are out of gamut for my target.
Yeah.
And so you as colorists need to work how to address that. That's implicit in this. I think in the case of Andy's 3x3 matrix to compensate for his deuter anomaly, that's what he calls it. But the key point to remember about Andy's research, at least at the moment, is that he is claiming, and completely justifiably, as far as I can figure out, that he can correct his own deuter anomaly and that of anyone else, providing you give him half an hour's time to measure your own personal color matching functions. But that's not feasible on a large commercial scale. And in any event, when he walks into a laser cinema, in principle, you can correct the laser cinema for him, but then you break it for everybody else.
Yeah, it would have to be in his personal feed somehow.
It is observer dependent. And so then what you're able to do in the streaming video or the cinema domains is pretty limited because we enjoy watching this programming in groups, not just as an individual. So that modulates what we do as the commercial solution. There are a few things you can do, but it's very difficult. Then as a consequence of my Metamerism event on December the 4th, 3 of the attendees, Micha, Christian, and Veronica, presented their summary of the day, which is quite extensive and quite good, presented that to IMAGO.
Yeah. I'll link to that so people can read through it as well. Were there any, Danielle from Baselight, Filmlight was there, Bram, who I know Bram he's a bit sick and tired of this chasing wide gamuts and chasing brighter and brighter nits. He's kind of, from what I understand, he's of the camp of enough is enough. It's good. And we're just getting ourselves into more and more Metamerism problems. But was there any, I'd say, traction or resolutions or anything that you could see as a way forward? Because presumably we're in the grips of you spoke about it already. It's got to sell. It's got to have marketing. And if you want to sell TVs next year, they've got to be bigger, better, brighter than TVs last year. So the one thing you use is bigger gamut and brighter nit values, which are not necessarily what we actually need.
Well, exactly so. So it's a key point for colorists. By far, the dominant deliverable today, it's, to the extent that HDR is a deliverable. So then maybe for your fans, maybe it's half and half SDR, HDR.
Right.
There's still tons of SDR. And, you got to get the SDR right in order to get the HDR right. So that's got to be your starting point.
They go hand in hand, yeah.
Well, the way that I describe it, HDR is just SDR plus specular highlights.
Right.
Well, specular highlights and direct light sources. So things that you wouldn't have clipped except you had to.
Right.
But at core, it's just SDR. So let's say half of your audience they're delivering 1886.
Right.
And I'm being careful to call it 1886 and not 709, even though in the broader community of producers and directors and buyers and sellers of programs, they just call it 709. But that's not technically correct. Technically, it's 1886. And 709 only talks about cameras.
Right.
There is no EOTF defined in 709. And there should have been, but there wasn't. And that EOTF for SDR, although by that time HD, was only adopted in 2011, and that's 1886. So concerning the delivery, we should call it 1886. But then the other half of your deliverables are HDR, either Dolby Vision or HDR10. They're DQ, otherwise known as ST2084. And then there's I'll call it a minority of deliverable video, but it's live video almost exclusively that's HLG. So in terms of packaged programs, they're typically not HLG. So then though that programming is either Dolby Vision or HDR10 packaged in a BT 2020 container, but not actually using BT 2020 primaries. They were virtually all today mastered DCI-P3.
That's it.
So then the question is, it's an existential question facing the studio and distribution and streaming communities. Should there be, in the next 10 years, a wider gamut than DCI-P3 for distribution? And some people say, well, yeah, of course there should be. It's BT 2020. Primaries for programming.
Yeah.
But that's basically wrong and not widely understood as being wrong, but it's wrong. It's wrong because although BT 2020 red and blue can be achieved with reasonable light sources, even OLEDs, BT 2020 green is on the spectrum, and it can only be achieved by a laser,
Right.
and lasers are not going to be widespread, commercially viable for consumer displays. They're in a sense already viable for theater, and then there's some technical issues. One of them is certainly metamerism.
Right.
Another is laser speckle.
Yeah.
Another is, can cinema audiences handle these ultra hyper color saturated colors, and do they find that a pleasant experience?
Right.
And the answer is almost certainly no.
I mean, especially if you ask Steve Yedlin, he would say categorically no to all this.
Yeah. So then there's this rather large group, unfortunately, of what I will classify, and it's not necessarily a compliment, marketers.
Yeah.
Who think we need to go bigger, brighter, more and more colorful. And that's not necessarily the case in practice. But if your goal is to write things on spec sheets, then yes. And anybody who's writing N% of something, they're doing that for the purpose of the spec sheet.
Right.
They're not doing that for the purpose of understanding the perception of color, well, A, images, and B, more importantly, stories told with color images, which is really what you and I take as our goal.
Yeah.
We seek to enable the telling of stories, not the, stimulation of humans using color. And, in advertising, it's not a coincidence that a Tide detergent box is fluorescent orange.
Right.
For marketing purposes, that sells. But I argue that's not the way to tell a story. it may unfortunately be the way to run a commercial. And, it's a fact of life today that even in the cinemas, we have to sit through 15 minutes of commercials before we get to the movie.
I do think it's a bit like it's a acclimatization, and you have something sweet,
Yeah.
and you get used to that level of sweetness, and you think, okay, I can probably have a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So
Okay,
yeah,
but here,
it's something to do with restraint, which is not really what we're good at.
well, okay, but that's exactly the story. So then here's an analogy for you from the music business. They will show you for a pop song just the peak level. I mean, the level averaged over each 100 milliseconds. Even in the 90s, maybe even in the 2000s, there's a dynamic. There's modulation.
Yeah.
And what you see today is a flat line. They've raised the average loudness as high as they can get it to the penalty of putting everything in the same dynamics.
Right.
Where in the 90s and the 2000s, pop songs were dynamic. My own personal specific example would be Nirvana.
Right.
Where Kurt Cobain's vocal style, at one moment he's screaming and, 10 seconds later he's whispering.
Right.
So the dynamics are what built that signature sound. Like you and I probably recognize a Nirvana piece on the radio, even if we never heard it before.
Right.
But pop music today doesn't have that. So it's a missing of the dynamics. And, we call this new technology high dynamic range. So in principle, it's there to do dynamics, but the dynamics require that, high level in a certain part and then a low level in another part. And it's that playing back and forth between them that literally makes the dynamics. So then today HDR would be mastered at 1,000 nit peak,
Right.
200 nit reference, which then, some people would call that the diffuse white. And if you contrast it with SDR, diffuse white is reasonable. I've been engaged for about 2 or 3 years in collecting image examples for use in my workshops and seminars where you cannot identify diffuse white in an image. And I've got by now like 50 of these. Some of them, it can be a nighttime scene in Tokyo when it's raining. It can be a scene in the mountains on a trail on a foggy day. You just can't identify any diffuse white. So then, for a long time, I maintained this idea that we should have a metadata tag. It's put there by you, the colorist, which is what's the absolute nit measurement of diffuse white. And I still think that's important, but I'm not calling it diffuse white anymore. I'm calling it, honestly, I don't know what to call it.
Because I've heard this a lot. That people like this, they hear this, they see the diffuse whites in the standard, but they don't actually know what that thing is, what it means. Is that the roll-off point? And yeah.
Well, okay, so then I'll tell you what I think it should be. And my definition pretty closely aligns with what Apple are doing. Surprise, surprise, they're a lot more influential than I am. They didn't invent square pixels, but they've got a lot of influence. And so they're really doing excellent work on HDR. They figured out that on their desktop OS graphics subsystem, they need to incorporate HDR,
Right.
but they don't want to push your windows and menus and icons and pointers up to the peak HDR limits.
Yeah.
So then they define the classic SDR reference white, which was very, very, very similar to diffuse white in classic SDR.
Right.
Because if you in SDR, even today, drop somebody's white shirt to 70 units, your audience will believe that the shirt is gray.
Yeah, it'll feel a bit off.
It'll feel off. You know what? There's a term for this. So the old-time cinematographers, they used to dye white shirts.
Yeah, make them a bit off. Yeah.
They would dye the white shirt so the reflectance is not 90% like a white shirt. Instead, the reflectance is only 75%, but then it would read as a white shirt.
An actor with dark skin wearing a brand new white shirt, it was hell. You could never expose for both the face and the shirt.
Well, it's for that reason, but it's also, I think, if you're doing a jewelry ad, where the bride is wearing white, maybe you want the bride to be wearing something that's very light gray.
Right.
And then the jewelry can run up to 100 units. And so it's brighter than her dress. So those are the issues that came up even in SDR. So then Apple decided they're going to declare reference white to be essentially the top end of SDR. And they also call that graphics white because the windows, the menus, the icons, the desktop background, they all map to there instead of mapping to there.
Right.
So when you plug an HDR display into a Mac, your desktop environment is living where it always used to live. It's just that if a particular window has got HDR content, then it can punch the direct light sources and the specular highlights above that. But then, so in effect, Apple has got this metadata element attached to each window on the screen. And then that's what we should think of even when we deliver, because then the display may have more or less HDR capability, and it may then need to do local display mapping, that's using Dolby's term. Right. And it would be responsive to that.
There seem to be some systems that are being developed in China now that are coming to basically be poor man's Dolby or free Dolby. There's systems that are developing.
HDR Vivid.
That's it. So yeah, interesting how that'll develop. Oh, and my lecturer last week said that he had heard that Apple at the CIE, it's CIE Division 1 and Division 6 or 8 or something like that, they've made a proposal that they plan to reanalyze and redo the human observer with ... some new technology. So I've no idea what it could. I mean, the first thing I thought about is if you're doing, it was always 2-degree or 10-degree observers, right? Yeah. But what if you put on a Vision Pro so that there's no reference? Okay, I mean, this is against my beliefs because I believe everything is relative to the environment. So you're looking at a 2-degree port, but you're still aware of blackness or grayness around that 2-degree port. But
your adaptation is driven by the surrounding.
So if you're in a Vision Pro 360 headset and everything is the reference color, or it's just split half down the middle, and you do matching in that environment, does that have any benefits? But it's not like a laser. Narrow primary device. It's actually got broad primary, so that wouldn't work.
Yeah, so Apple certainly are engaged at, CIE, ISO, and their HDR work has been taken to those forums. I've not heard about Apple trying to redefine the standard observer. I mean, the current best approximation to human vision is Stockman 2006.
Right.
And he got that adopted by the CIE as the 2006 standard observer.
Right.
And I honestly don't see Apple making a pitch to replace that. It's very, very solid work. But Apple, they're well informed about these things. Stockman, he's Mr. LMS, so it's all derived from LMS. And there's very deep and important and conceptual discussions within the color science and color vision communities. Can you even mix LMS in the right proportions to make the luminance sensitivity? Or is it a fourth curve on its own?
Right.
So then that's a very subtle, deep, complex question. And, for engineering purposes for the moment, well, we just mix them. We just find the right mix.
Yeah.
And, we're stuck with having an installed base of, 100,000 instruments, which have got the CIE 1931 curves, built into the optical filters. They're not going to change.
Right.
And that's effectively the interchange of the measurements is done in that space.
We're actually relying on 1930s mathematics, which was purposefully done to be done easily on slide rules. Nothing, everything had to be in the top right quadrant. It had to be positive.
Yeah.
We couldn't have negative values. It was
No,
just
right.
a whole lot of very elegant mathematical flips and backflips and turns. Does that need to be relooked at, or is it just the underlying data and we still pipe that through the same mathematical chain? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so basically, if I can answer that question to my best knowledge, I can give you an answer that's kind of halfway between the science community and the practical engineering programs and making movies. It's
Right.
where I live is halfway between, really.
Right.
I would say that you and I should expect different systems to be used at different places in the pipeline. Because you and I are going to expect the display measurements, 95% or more, will be made with an instrument that's best used with the 1931 curves. I mean, you and I know display calibrators who make spectral measurements. Like they're not just reporting the little X, little Y.
Yes.
They're giving us spectral measurements. But honestly, it's still a bit of a research with a small r question. Should they be using Stockman's 2006 numbers? Well, Stockman did the LMS curves. And so can you take Stockman's LMS curves and then do little x, little y, little z math on them? It's exactly your question, right?
Yeah.
And it's not completely clear.
Right.
And then what's the goal in making these measurements? Is the goal in making those measurements getting the best visual approximation for a large number of ordinary people sitting in a motion picture cinema?
Yeah, male, female, young, old, all the cultures around the world. Yeah.
That should be we don't want to be grading for Asia and grading for North America differently.
Right.
We do want one deliverable master. And yeah, we're going to subtitle them differently. We're going to put the audio on different. We might even clip a few scenes differently, but we really don't want to make the color different. It's just already complex.
Yeah.
So then it's a bit of an open question, exactly the one about, should you be taking Stockman 2006 measurements and doing big X, big Y, big Z math on them? Honestly, I don't know. But I do know that if you ask me a particular question at some particular place in the chain, whether it's like measuring the LEDs on the wall or measuring the camera response in the VP set or measuring your mastering monitor at grading or whether it's mastering the approval cinema, all of those things could potentially be a little bit different because it's got, it's like the dial phone thing. Well, we still need pulse dialing in the cinemas. It's an infrastructure, installed base, craftsmanship, expectation. It's not just a science question.
Right.
There's no doubt in my mind that over the next 10 years, we will see handheld devices that can be tuned for individual observers. So then Andy Ryder gets to look at his iPhone and it's white instead of pink.
Right.
But then only when he's looking at it. When I look at it, it's greenish.
Yeah, there'll be the calibration stage, which you do at the iPhone store.
That could well be. It could very well be. We already know that, just from broadly available information, that Apple, when you order up your new iPhone, they will etch your initials into the Illuminant at the back, right? They already, they're onto the value of personalization.
Presumably you could do that with something, just a screen. And if you adjust some sliders on the screen to say, make these match, make these match, make these match, hence, this is probably your...
Well, I wouldn't, I'm not ready to make that step. I mean, maybe. And, Andy Ryder, he's your local expert on that. But then, I did have Daniele Siragusano, who
Yep.
you and I know well from Filmlight, who's absolutely expert in such matters. John Frith was my host at that event because we conducted it at what was, I'm sad to say, a beautiful screening room downstairs at MPC/Technicolor in Soho, which is just very sadly now
gone
under. Leaving John, so he is an expert in such matters, particularly on the display side. Daniele, who we mentioned, Bram, who we mentioned, and Jean-Philippe Jacquemin, who's a very senior guy. His title is product manager. So we had a reading on the Metamerism question from a world expert on the laser display side. So then, wrapping back to your question of half an hour ago, so then my preference, and I think generally agreed by everybody who was presenting at Metamerism Experts Day, BT 2020 absolutely should not ever be thought of as a target for content. And the open question, and this is very much Bram's question, is there a legitimate commercial need, or even you might say consumer expectation, for a gamut a little bigger than DCI-P3 that could be standardized?
Yeah.
So, the fact that we're all making DCI-P3 streaming video today was not standardized by the streaming video community. That's a byproduct of DCI-P3 being a really well-considered, well-proven, well-documented, and well-standardized scheme from the digital cinema community, not from the streaming video community.
Right.
Literally DCI-P3 was standardized when Netflix were still mailing DVDs. That's literally true. The news about Netflix is they didn't call it Netflix by accident. The fact that the name Netflix does not evoke putting DVDs in mailing cartons.
I'm old enough to remember that. Yeah,
of course.
When they actually did that.
But they called it Netflix for a reason. They weren't headed toward mailing DVDs.
Mailing forever, yeah.
Yeah, no, they were headed toward shipping movies and other programming across the net. So then that is when the DCI-P3 spec was standardized, before there was such a thing as over-the-top streaming video. But it was such a solid standard that it stuck. So now the question for Bram and others is, is there a place for a new, wider gamut standard, but not falling into the trap basically caused by disinformation, and lack of understanding by some marketing people? And QD-OLED sits right there. And, honestly, so does LG white OLED.
Yeah.
They can tune their green filter to be where they need it to be and could achieve slightly wider than DCI-P3 green. But don't try to do 2020 as a target, treat it as a container. And, there's a certain unnamed LinkedIn presence who seems not to understand that and who believes that 2020 is more than a container. And he then exchanged email with my buddy Masaoka-san, who's the guy who computed the BT 2020 numbers.
Right.
The LinkedIn influencer posted this, what I consider to be a misquote from Masaoka, saying, oh, yeah, I want it to be the images. Well, Masaoka himself understands well that its main use is as a container, and it's just not useful to, the people who make images, they're smart enough to realize there's not going to be lasers in consumer space. They can't guarantee accuracy or fidelity if they start delivering imagery in BT 2020.
Your Metamerism Experts Day was a good summary of everything, the biology, even to 10%, roughly up to 10% of the population who has serious biological issues because their primaries have been shifted. There's manufacturing concerns. There's, just chasing a standard that gets harder. And I mean, if you speak to a colorist now who's tasked with buying a laser projector to install in their facility to then grade films accurately, it's a pain in the ass. They would much rather have Xenons. So for us as the producers, it's a pain.
John Frith being extremely familiar with such matters. I mean, we had Jean-Philippe from Barco, who's very much a laser cinema projection wizard. But we also had John Frith, who was Technicolor's, worldwide color display guy. And, he's a very soft-spoken, understated guy. And, he's saying basically, well, for the moment, you might want to stick with Xenon. He's basically saying, we don't have the confidence to jump to laser cinema for mastering.
Right.
John is a pragmatic guy. He understands that it's going to be, I don't think it's a majority of cinema experience today, but it could be 40% today, maybe. I'm not sure.
Maximum, yeah.
The other element for cinema is whether there's a few different lasers with a few different wavelengths. And I'm not motivated at the moment to go and take my spectroradiometer and try to sneak into the back of the Odeon cinema and measure their primaries. I'm not connected with anybody in Toronto to do that.
You're going to have to convince them that you're not pirating the movie. No, I'm just stealing the colors. I'm not stealing the movie.
This looks just like a very sophisticated camera.
But I'm pointing it the other way. I'm pointing back, not forward.
No, it's a one. Believe me, sir, it's a 1-pixel camera.
You're stealing our pixels. Not one.
I wish that the cinema projector vendors would just tell us what the wavelengths are. We can measure it, but it's a big job to measure it.
Yeah.
I understand they don't want to be held to it, but there's a long tradition in electronic data sheets of having typical values, even if the min and the max are blank.
Right.
The chip vendors would still tell you what's the typical.
Same with the Kodak response curves. They're approximate.
Oh, they tell you in a footnote.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily what you got.
Yeah.
It's just what we measured in the lab from one roll. Yeah, and that's totally fair game, right? But at the moment, it is the case that many digital cinema projectors have a multiplicity of lines.
Right.
And so that reduces the metamerism problem and also reduces the speckle problem, which you may remember we heard a lot about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And we even had people that had motor drives on the screen. I don't know if you ever came across those, but
there's a projector that I saw a review of yesterday that's got a thing to remove these banding and spectral effects. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you have dispersed spectral lines, then you don't have to do that, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And so in a sense, it's easier. Because all of the laser projectors have got a bunch of laser diodes, not just one. And so if you're able to convince the manufacturer, give us our slightly off-spec laser diodes, we want them all mixed together.
See, I'm telling you, my nudge primaries, it's coming. We've got high resolution. We'll just use
maybe.
We'll just use a whole cluster of pixels for different wavelengths. Okay, Charles, we've done a long time.
So, it's a long piece for your enthusiasts. I hope they enjoy it.
No, absolute pleasure. A treat for them. Thank you so much for your time.
Good. It's a treat to have a long chat with you.
Cool. Thanks, Charles. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again for listening to the Color Mentor podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can leave comments on Patreon or Instagram. The Instagram handle is color.mentor. And remember to head over to the Color Mentor page on patreon.com and check out the goodies there. We'll see you next time.